once again we're going to change the tone a lot and welcome to us to Simon Baron-Cohen, who's the Professor of Developmental Psychopathology at Cambridge. And he's going to talk to us about this book with the name 0 Degrees of Empathy, A New Theory of Human Cruelty. And I was looking at some of the slides earlier, and they looked quite, they looked also pretty terrifying too. So welcome, don't scare us too much.
Good evening, and it's a pleasure to be here this evening. The topic I'm going to be talking to you about is a little depressing, so apologies for that. I'm going to be addressing the whole question of how human beings are capable of being cruel to other people. The title of my new book, as you've just heard, is 0 Degrees of Empathy, and I'm going to be arguing that empathy lies at the heart of how we treat each other. I'm going to start with this image, which, again, apologies for how disturbing it is. But this is a photograph of 2 scientists, 2 doctors working in the Dachau concentration camp, performing an experiment on a person. They called it the freezing water immersion experiment. And what these 2 doctors were interested in was how long a human being could stay alive in freezing water. Like good scientists, they took measurements, they carried out systematic observation, they looked at the heart rate, the temperature of their subject, and obviously the time till death. What strikes us all these years later is not the fact that the experiment was perhaps of medical interest, but how these 2 doctors could lose sight of the fact that the subject in their experiment was a person with feelings, with subjectivity. Obviously, we are used to examples from the Holocaust to think about extremes of human cruelty, but those aren't the only kinds of examples of human cruelty. Indeed, we only need to open any newspaper, turn on the news, to confront examples of human cruelty every day. So here I'll just give you 3 other examples, and I think that's more than enough. I don't want to burden you with it before we address the question of how is this possible. So the first is of a man who pushes a broken beer bottle into the face of somebody else standing in the pub. And we have to ask ourselves, how is it possible that you can simply injure, indeed kill another person through acts of physical violence? The second example, as you can see, is of a mother who screams at her child, "I hate you." So here we have an example of not physical aggression, but verbal aggression, where the woman may be, to some extent, oblivious of the effects of her words on the young child and the lasting effect that they may have. And the third example is of a soldier who, in the course of their duty, defending their country, also commits rape. And we hear of these examples all the time, even amongst peacekeeping forces like the UN. Well, the old theory of human cruelty was in terms of evil. We say that so-and-so did this bad thing because they are evil. I'm going to argue that that's not really an explanation, although it's a very available concept, the concept of evil. It doesn't really explain the behavior. I'm a psychologist, I conduct research, and part of what we want to understand is an explanation for the behavior. In fact, I'd go even further to say that the term evil is really circular, because you can define evil as the absence of good. And so we're simply saying somebody did something bad because they're bad. It's really quite circular. The new theory that I'm arguing for in my book is that we're much better to use the concept of empathy, and particularly the erosion of empathy, to explain how people can do bad things to each other. And I'm arguing this is a better theory because it's scientifically tractable. You can measure it, and it makes predictions. So we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. I want to start by just a definition. What do we mean by empathy? There are many definitions of empathy out there. My definition recognizes two parts. The first is what psychologists call cognitive. It's the drive to put yourself into someone else's shoes, to imagine what someone else is thinking or feeling. So that's the recognition element of someone else's mind. The second part is what psychologists call affective. That's the ability to feel an appropriate emotion in response to somebody else's state of mind. And I'm going to argue that you need both of these elements, the cognitive and the affective, to say that somebody has empathy. And indeed, when we think about psychopaths, which I'll come on to shortly, they may have the first component of empathy, being very capable of recognizing that their victim is in pain, but lack the second part, the affective part, so not having the appropriate emotional response to wanting to alleviate another person's distress. The other idea I want to convey is that empathy isn't all or none. It comes by degrees. And in fact, when we measure empathy, we discover that empathy is on a bell curve. Like many characteristics, it's on a spectrum. Most of us are in the average range in terms of empathy, but some people are above average. You can talk about them having superior empathy, and other people are way down the end on that scale at 0 degrees of empathy. And I'm going to ask the question about what leads a person to end up at different points on that empathy curve. Well, here's a way that you can measure empathy. As psychologists, we use questionnaires. That's one method. And this one's called the empathy quotient, where you read through different descriptions and you say whether you agree or disagree with each description as a description of you. And what you find when you use multiple examples of this kind is that just as that model predicted of an empathy bell curve, actual data confirms that most of us are somewhere in the middle, but there are people at either extreme. In terms of medicine, and particularly psychiatry, we can see that there are some well-known syndromes that can lead individuals to have 0 degrees of empathy. And I'm going to briefly touch on 3 of these, which are all under the heading of the personality disorders. The first is borderline personality disorder. Many of you will have heard of this, and you can see a photograph there of Marilyn Monroe, famous for her career as an actress, but many of you may know that she also suffered from borderline personality disorder. You can see that the diagnosis of this is all about instability in relationships. These are individuals who find it very difficult to sustain close relationships and can turn with anger even onto people who are close to them, so that love turns to hate in seconds. The second is psychopathic personality disorder, sometimes called antisocial personality disorder. You can see a picture from the movie Silence of the Lambs, but psychopaths are not just in the world of fiction and drama, but they're in society all around us. We heard from Misha a little earlier about people who commit serious crimes without thinking about their victims' feelings, and psychopaths would be one contributor to crime. You can see that the diagnosis of becoming a psychopath rests on this superficial charm that they can lull you into trusting them, but it then turns out that almost everything they say and do is a pack of lies. It takes a certain amount of empathy to be able to manipulate somebody else's state of mind, to make other people believe that things are true when in fact they're false. But the psychopath, if we imagine someone who turns up at the old woman's house pretending to be the gas man to read the meter, and once he's gained access into her house, mugs her and robs her of her savings, we've got the idea of someone who is callous, is only self-seeking in terms of their profit, and really doesn't care about the consequences of their actions. Finally, the personality disorder called narcissism, which is less well known, but where individuals have this inflated sense of their own importance. They believe they're somehow special or entitled, so that they don't need to queue up like everybody else. They believe that they're entitled to privileges that other people aren't. their behavior is really based on only thinking about themselves and very little consideration of others. Now, these three types of personality disorder, they are personality disorders in the sense that they're long-lasting characteristics of an individual. But what we can see is that they also all involve this erosion of empathy, that empathy either never developed normally in the first place or has shut down at the very least temporarily. Why could this have happened? Well, John Bowlby, the psychoanalyst and paediatrician working at the Tavistock up in Swiss Cottage, his argument was early experience contributes to the erosion of empathy. So he argued that what parents give their children through parental love is a secure attachment, and that when you have that primary attachment to a caregiver, you can go on to form relationships that are caring, capable of caring for others and trusting. And that children who miss out on that vital experience, that early parental love, who suffer from what he called insecure attachment, find it difficult to form attachments, to form relationships, and are capable of hurting other people. His evidence for that came from his study of delinquents. He was looking at teenagers who'd already got into petty crime by teenage and who'd been brought up in children's homes or foster families where they'd never had that opportunity to form secure relationships. And the evidence for the importance of early experience, I think, comes from borderline personality disorder, because some 80% of people with that adult outcome suffered neglect or abuse in childhood. So there's no doubt that early experience is important in the development of empathy. But what we also know is that that can't be the whole story. This is a study that was conducted at the Institute of Psychiatry down in Camberwell in South London, where they looked at not only whether people had suffered early neglect or maltreatment, but also which version of a particular gene they were carrying. They were looking at a gene called MAOA, and this gene comes in two varieties. You can see it depicted here in two different colors. And what they found was your likelihood of becoming delinquent, of ending up with this diagnosis called conduct disorder in teenage, was not only a function of whether you'd experienced early maltreatment, but also which version of this gene you were carrying. So this is telling us that environment is important, but so is our genetic makeup. And just to lead on to another aspect of biology that might influence empathy, we've been looking at testosterone, the so-called male hormone, although both sexes produce it. It's just that males produce a lot more of it. And we've been looking at this hormone in the womb. So the fetus is producing its own testosterone. We've been asking women who are pregnant and who are having amniocentesis if we can measure the hormone in that fluid. They consent, and then we follow up the child after they're born to see if there's any relationship between prenatal hormones, testosterone levels produced by the baby, and how much empathy the child has in childhood. What you can see is we've given the children aged 8 years old a test of empathy where they have to look at photographs and pick which word best describes what the person in the photo is thinking or feeling. So it's a test of whether you can read someone else's facial expression. Here the correct answer is that the man is interested in something. So it's a subtle test of whether you can pick up on somebody else's state of mind. And the graph down below shows a negative correlation with fetal testosterone. That's to say, the higher the baby's testosterone levels in the womb, the more difficulty they're having in reading faces to decode someone else's facial expressions some 8 years later. So this is telling us that environment is important, but so are genes, and now, as we can see, so are hormones. So far I've said nothing about the brain, and we might wonder, where does empathy live in the brain? The best evidence, or the first evidence to answer this question, came from a very famous neurological case study of a man called Phineas Gage. He was working on the railroad track in the 1840s, and his job was to use a metal pole to push the dynamite down before they laid the railroad track Unfortunately for Phineas, the dynamite exploded prematurely one day, blowing the rod right up under his eye and through his brain. He suffered this horrendous injury, but he didn't die. Indeed, he lived for another 12 years. And the doctors at the time documented that what seemed to have changed about him was not his reasoning was still very good, nor his language, nor his memory, nor his intelligence. What seemed to have changed was his empathy. That prior to the accident, he was described as being a very courteous, polite, sensitive individual. After the injury, he was described as very rude, unable to judge what was socially appropriate in different situations. Over a century later, the neuroscientist Hannah Damasio was able to obtain Phineas's brain, put it into a modern MRI scanner to see exactly where the damage was, and she was able to localize it to a part of the frontal lobe on the left. It's called the left ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So if anyone asks you where is empathy in the brain, it's just in the frontal lobes. And what we know from the advances in neuroscience over the last 10 years is that that's certainly one of the places involved in empathy. It's not the only place, and I'm not going to read you all of these long names, but by my count, there are at least 10 different parts of the brain involved in empathy. So we can talk about a circuit in the brain, the empathy circuit, and when people commit acts of cruelty, like psychopaths, like people with borderline personality disorder, we see parts of that empathy circuit showing underactivity or having failed to develop in the normal way. I'm going to briefly mention the condition of autism, because people with autism also struggle with empathy, but what's of interest is that they don't tend to go on to hurt other people. And that may be because autism, unlike psychopaths, people with autism seem to only have difficulties with the cognitive part of their empathy. The affective part, that emotional response, seems to be intact. So people with autism find it difficult to read other people, to figure out other people's intentions, to make sense of their facial expressions. But once they've been told about another person's state of mind, they're very capable of caring about them. Examples might be that if you tell someone with autism that somebody else's pet just died, they will feel moved by that story. So unlike the psychopath, who may be capable of reading other people's behavior but just not care, people with autism may show the opposite profile. And I'm going to finish just with one final illustration, but this time of somebody who I think might be at the opposite end of the empathy spectrum. Raoul Wallenberg, some of you may know his story, but he was working as a Swedish diplomat in 1944 in Budapest when he could see that the Jews in that town were being put on the trains to be taken off to the concentration camps. And what he did, single-handedly, was to forge Swedish passports and climb on top of the trains, pushing them through the windows so that the prisoners on the train could pick up these fake Swedish passports. And then Wallenberg told the Nazi guards on the platform to open the doors of the train and let them off the train because they were Swedish citizens. He carried on doing this and was able to save literally hundreds of individuals, and he rented buildings all over Budapest, putting the Swedish flag outside of them, claiming that they were the Swedish Library, the Swedish Arts Institute, but in fact he was hiding Jewish refugees in there to get them out of, to avoid that otherwise tragic fate. Wallenberg himself disappeared, presumed died at the age of 37, having been hunted down. But I think it's an example of someone who was using his empathy to fire up his own altruism, risking his own life because he cared about others. I'm going to conclude by just making 3 points. That empathy is very important. I think it depends on the functioning of a circuit in the brain, which we can call the empathy circuit, which itself is a function of our early experience, but also our biology, our genes, and our culture. The second point is that acts of cruelty, we must assume, involve the erosion of empathy. At the very moment that someone commits an act of cruelty, we must assume that their empathy has gone down. But what we've learned is that low empathy by itself doesn't necessarily lead to acts of cruelty. It could just lead, as in the case of autism, to social withdrawal, where you find other people confusing, but you don't go on to hurt them. And that just simply depends on which part of that empathy circuit is affected. And my last point is somewhat aspirational, which is just to argue that empathy is a very valuable resource. Indeed, I would say the most valuable human resource. And that's simply because empathy can be used to resolve conflict. If we're talking about conflict between two individuals, or if we're talking about conflict between two nations, the idea that you could, instead of resorting to physical means to get what you want, or to resolve a conflict, or resorting to legal channels, you could simply talk to the other person to understand another person's point of view. It's much cheaper and ultimately available as a natural resource to us. And I'll invite you to visit our website for any more details of the research. Thank you.